Hello, everyone. So, most of this course really deals with kind of big economic questions. The first half's all about the determinants of economic growth. The second half, we're really going to be digging into the causes and consequences of financial crises. But here in the middle, I want to slow down just a little bit and focus on a more specific story about the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is really interesting because it is an environmental crisis that's causes were deeply economic. So I grew up in Oklahoma, and a lot of folks in Oklahoma have family out west in California. And the reason for this is that most of the Central Plains during the 1930s were dealing with the dual burden of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, which created a huge amount of economic migration. Out in California, Peter actually grew up alongside a lot of the children of these Dust Bowl refugees. And the underlying mechanisms that really made all this happen were overproduction of agricultural commodities, accumulation of debt by farmers, the specific farming technology that was being used in that region at the time, and the droughts really just kind of what kicked it all into high gear. The Dust Bowl was widespread, covering much of the central plains of the US, but for illustration, I want to focus for a moment just on these three counties in the panhandle of Oklahoma. So this graph shows the population of those three counties from 1880 up to 2010. And we can see starting from 1880, 1890, there were hardly any people out in this region. And then there's a sudden explosion up to above 30,000 people by 1910. And this corresponds with a major boom in wheat and the arrival of a lot of farmers. And then finally, by the 1930s, we're beginning a steep decline. The scale of this is betrayed a bit by that meteoric growth at the beginning, but this was a substantial dip. The population fell by more than 30%, and even in 2020, these three counties have fewer people than they did in 1910. So, before getting into the economic causes of the crisis, it might be worth talking about what came before just a little bit. Especially at that time, before the farmers showed up, this region, large swaths of it were a sea of grass. Very difficult to navigate. The early Spanish explorers placed lots of wooden stakes to guide them because there were so few landmarks. And the tribes that called this area home were largely nomadic. And you got to remember, this is before the arrival of the horse. So, nomadic tribes who didn't have a beast of burden and had to carry most everything on their back. And one of these tribes were the Comanche. And I think the Comanche provide an interesting counterpoint to some of Jared Diamond's arguments, which we had to take a look at earlier in the semester. A major criticism of Guns, Germs, and Steel is that it's really reductive, right? All economic growth is the consequence of geographic conditions, and it really removes any role for human agency in the determination of economic growth. And the Comanche are a really interesting case where one group adapts to changes in their environment much more completely than other groups, and it makes them very successful, at least for a time. Initially, the Comanche were a really minor tribe. They were small, they were largely pushed around by tribes like the Apache, which were much more powerful. But when the Spanish turned up and brought with them horses, the Comanche embraced them far more than any other tribe. They quickly saw both its military and its economic value. And by 1780, they had grown to be the largest tribe in the Great Plains region, with a population of between 20 and 40,000. They didn't really start to decline until the end of the Civil War, because with that over, the gaze of Texas went westward, and there was a concerted effort to rid the land of them. This involved a long series of military campaigns that I'm not going to get into here, but a big part of it was cutting out the economic base of Comanche society. So there was a concerted effort to eradicate the bison. And by between 1865 and 1875, the number of bison fell from 15 million to 1 million in the region. And in that same year, 1875, is when the Comanche finally surrendered and were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory. It didn't take long after that for the ranchers to show up. The Texas legislature needed a new state capital, and they promised 3 million acres in the Texas Panhandle to anyone who would build it for them. So a coalition of investors from Great Britain and Chicago accepted the deal, and they started the XIT Ranch out in the Texas Panhandle. It was by far the largest ranch in the world. It had 150,000 cattle and more than 700 miles of fence in 1887. But this economic boom in the Texas Panhandle would eventually go bust as cattle prices fell. These large ranches became victims of their own success as prices fell from more than $28 a head down to $16.90 by 1896, and it didn't take long for the XIT to fold. And this really gets us to the starting point of our main story here, which is when the farmers arrive. The Great Plains contained some of the last land that could be gained via something like the Homestead Act. The U.S. had long given federal Western land to people if they would prove it up, if they would farm it. And as time went on, it got more and more precious with that land and gave away less and less of it. And the Great Plains were some of the last pieces of that left. And just like any land boom, there were lots of moving parts here. You had the Homestead Act lands, you also had railroads who owned a lot of land, and these declining ranches that were all selling land to people to get them to move to the Great Plains. And you can see here an example of one of the ads that uses the word profit a whole heck of a lot and gives some very concrete illustrations of what life on the plains might look like. And a lot of farmers did find success on the Great Plains. This graph shows wheat prices over this period, and we see steady growth from about 1900 to 1915, and that's followed by this massive spike and almost doubling in the price of wheat. And what's going on there is the First World War. So much of Europe was cut off from grain exports from Russia, and the US stepped in to fill that gap. And the way in which it did it was via price supports. So it would purchase as much wheat as anyone would sell it at this very high price. And we can also see that this period of high prices on this rainfall graph roughly corresponds to a lot of wet years. And so farmers came out of this period optimistic and flush with cash, and importantly, ready to take on a lot of debt. The technology of farming at the time also played a role. Coming off of all of these fat years, the farmers were flush with cash and ready to take on a lot of debt, and there were loads of things they could spend that money on. The farm was becoming mechanized for the first time. So you had farmers purchasing combines, tractors, and what they pulled behind those tractors were disc plows. So the disc plow, pictured there, chops up the soil into all these really tiny little pieces. And it doesn't leave the deep furrows that a more traditional chisel plow does. And what that means is that the soil is much more exposed to wind erosion. Also, a contributing factor was the type of wheat that they grew there. They grew red winter wheat, which gets planted in late fall, early winter, sits in the field over the winter, and then starts growing in the spring and is finally harvested in the early summer. So for all those winter months, the fields have literally no ground cover on them. And all of these purchases meant a lot of debt. So farmers became much more productive, but indebted. And eventually, the First World War ended, those price supports declined, but farmers were still stuck with the land and capital that was good for little else but farming wheat. And this led to a weird situation where a falling price of wheat actually increased the supply of wheat. They had to grow more wheat so they could sell more wheat at those lower prices so that they could cover their debt obligations. And in 1931, which was probably the first or second year of the drought, it was the largest single wheat harvest in the region ever. Over 33 million acres were planted in wheat, and to put that in perspective, that's one Alabama. 1931 was already dry, but the drought would continue for almost a decade more. And some of the pictures from this period are just downright haunting. I mean, the dust storm photo in Dodge City, that being 10 a.m., that's just almost apocalyptic. Um, but eventually, these farmers would receive some help from the federal government. Much like during the Great Depression, which we're going to talk about more later in the semester, the initial response was minimal. The Hoover administration saw the Great Depression and even the Dust Bowl as short term problems that the market would adjust to. Eventually, people would stop farming wheat, and because the price would be so low, and the problem would solve itself. The Roosevelt administration took a very different tack, much like they did with the Great Depression, and had a lot of different strategies that they attempted to help the Dust Bowl farmers. One of the less successful was relocation. They would just simply pay farmers for their unproductive land and then move them elsewhere. Much more successful was soil conservation, where they educated farmers on less erosive farming practices, but also created giant shelter belts, these big bands of trees that cut across the Great Plains, meant to kind of serve as windbreaks. There was also a fair amount of direct aid in the form of cash and food, but maybe the most dramatic was product destruction, because remembering this is a crisis of agricultural prices, so one of the things the government would do is go out and pay people to destroy crops and livestock to help increase the price of those commodities, so they would have to farm less to make a living. So, wrapping up, the Dust Bowl is an environmental crisis, but its causes were economic. The 30s would have always been a dry decade, but if you pluck out the price policies around the First World War, or the availability of credit, or the specific farming technology of today, it probably doesn't become as large of a catastrophe as we saw. And something I find really interesting about it is how it demonstrates the limits of price signals. You had all of these folks who took on a lot of debt to make capital investment into farming, and they were not easily able to reallocate that capital to any other sort of economic activity. And so, being stuck in that position when the prices fell, they had no choice but to increase supply. Individually, none of these people were irrational. If we found ourselves in their shoes, we'd probably do much the same thing, but collectively it led to this massive collapse and overproduction crisis. And this is something that we will return to as a theme in later discussions of financial crisis. So that's pretty much it. A lot of this lecture comes from Timothy Egan's book, The Worst Hard Time, which is a good read. So thanks. Bye.